It is my pleasure, hang on a second, this was just swiped, to introduce Karen Merritt, who's been at the center now for quite a number of years, and who I actually first met when she was at the Office of the President working on graduate student data and reports, if I recall. She is going to be talking today on whether we can ever forgive Joseph Le Conte and how demanding and what a challenge it is of changing or keeping names on UC buildings. So Karen, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you everybody who's come. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes with some background information that I hope will help pinpoint some issues for discussion, but since I don't know the answer to the questions I'll be raising, I'm very, very much interested to hear what you think, and basically where do you go with the things that I'm going to be bringing up. As the United States is in the midst of a period of deep self-scrutiny over the issues of racial equity and social justice, commemorations of historic figures whose beliefs and actions were antithetical to these values are likewise under scrutiny. I'll begin this discussion of Joseph and John Le Conte, whose name appears on a Berkeley campus building, with some dates. The 1903 Le Conte Memorial Lodge, built by the Sierra Club in Yosemite Valley in Joseph Le Conte's honor, was made possible by donations from club members that included University of California and Stanford faculty and alumni, as well as the first two presidents of Stanford University, the University of California philanthropists Phoebe Apperson Hearst and Annie Alexander, and John Muir's and Joseph Le Conte's families. In 1924, the University of California named Le Conte Hall in honor of the brothers John Le Conte and Joseph Le Conte, the first and third faculty hired by the university, and in John's case, he served 2 stints as president of the university. In 2015, the Sierra Club requested that the National Park Service remove the name Joseph Le Conte from the Le Conte Memorial Lodge. More recently, the physics faculty at UC Berkeley asked that the name Le Conte be removed from the building housing their department. The reasons for these requests were variously the brothers' ownership of enslaved people, their active support of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and in Joseph's case, his writings on advocating white supremacy. So there are 3 topics I want to cover in this presentation: the brothers' upbringing and early history, the circumstances that brought them to the University of California, and their contributions to the new university that accounted for the high regard in which contemporaries held them, and the context for Joseph Le Conte's writings on white supremacy. The questions for discussion are, can we still honor the Le Contes as their contemporary friends and admirers did? If the answer is no, are there ways we can recognize what they accomplished and at the same time acknowledge their contributions to institutions and ideas that we now find contrary to the University of California's values? In many ways, Joseph Le Conte's writing on what he and others called the race problem were a rearguard effort to justify his personal history. He described his and his brother's upbringing more than once, and that's where I want to start the discussion. Descended from Huguenot and Puritan immigrants, John Le Conte was born in 1818 and Joseph Le Conte in 1824 to a family of 4 sons and 3 daughters in Liberty County, Georgia, about 40 miles to the southwest of Savannah. They were the third LeConte generation to live on the Woodmanston plantation in the middle of the Bulltown Swamp. Adored by his sons, Father Louis LeConte trained as a physician and was an amateur scientist with a chemistry lab in his attic, a library of science books, and a famous garden of botanical specimens that attracted visitors from the United States and abroad. Joseph's reminiscences describe a cocooned isolation in which the infrastructure was wholly constructed by 200 enslaved African Americans. They not only planted, cultivated, reaped the rice and cotton grown on the plantation, they were the masons, the shoemakers, the carpenters, the tanners, the gardeners, and other skilled laborers. During Joseph's first 16 years, he never went farther than 8 miles from Woodmanston. At first homeschooled by his father, Joseph reports that a handful of plantation owners pooled resources to hire a teacher for their sons, but only the last of what was a passing parade of instructors was worth remembering. This upbringing was, in Joseph's memory, nothing but idyllic. He calls plantation life a paradise for boys. LeConte boys' father encouraged them to hunt, fish, and play games with implements they made themselves. They would bring the fish and animals they caught to their father for scientific analysis and identification. They watched the plantation workers with curiosity, even joining in some of their labors. Joseph said, a constant source of delight and culture. He particularly remembered an elderly African, a Muslim, who described his original home and taught the boy to count in his original language. In later life, when Joseph began to write about race, he would claim that he never knew anything about the horrors of the slave trade and the mistreatment of people enslaved on plantations until after he left home. I'm going to insert a personal sidebar here. In 2015, my husband Russell, who you met, and I visited Woodmanston, now a publicly accessible open space preserve and National Historic Site. We took a picnic lunch with us, but the first sign we saw at the entrance was that day's mosquito activity, announcing that it was moderate. The mosquitoes made us the picnic. Joseph doesn't mention mosquitoes as he describes his family as suffering from malaria, even when they went to a summer retreat 3 miles from Woodmanston. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria wouldn't be discovered until the 1890s. John and Joseph followed their father's footsteps with a strong desire to become scientists. After completing undergraduate education at the University of Georgia's Franklin College, they both attended New York's College of Physicians and Surgeons for medical training, the closest thing in America at that time to education in the sciences as it was possible to get. When their father died in 1848, the older brother William took over the plantation, while John and Joseph practiced medicine variously and for various lengths of time in Savannah and Macon. They continued to hope for positions in the sciences. And here's Joseph. In 1850, Joseph Le Conte, his cousin, announced that he was going to Harvard to study with Louis Agassiz, one of America's foremost scientists, founder of Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School and the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, and a professor of geology and natural history. Joseph joined his cousin the two of the first four students to receive a science degree from the new school. In Harvard's heady atmosphere, Joseph studied botany with Asa Gray, became good friends with Richard Henry Dana, and crossed paths with the likes of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. During his 15 months at Harvard, Joseph participated in Agassiz's field trip to Florida to study corals, leading to his first paper delivered at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Those who studied with Agassiz, including Stanford's founding president, David Starr Jordan, remembered him as a mesmerizing and innovative teacher and effective advocate for educating the public about science. More about Agassiz and LeConte shortly. John had planned to study in Paris for further medical education, but on the death of brother William from malaria, he took over management of Woodmanston for the LeConte family. In 1846, he became chair of physics and chemistry at Franklin College. In 1854, chair of chemistry at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and then in 1855, chair of physics at South Carolina College in Columbia. Joseph completed faculty stints at Oglethorpe College and the University of Georgia, then joined John at South Carolina College as chair of geology and botany. The brothers continued to teach at South Carolina College through the first years of the Civil War, but by 1862, the students had cleared out to join the Confederate Army. At first, the brothers practiced medicine on behalf of the war effort, but then John was put in charge of the Confederate Niter Mining Bureau, where Joseph would join him. They pressed some of the Woodmanston's enslaved workers into service. During General William Sherman's march to the sea, both brothers became fugitives, John giving himself up and Joseph evading capture. After the war, they returned to South Carolina College, now called the University of South Carolina, which had been spared from being burnt as the rest of Columbia had been, owing to the use of the campus as a hospital. Until the college opened again for instruction, the brothers were destitute. Joseph asked his emancipated Woodmanston workers whether they would be willing to continue the rice and cotton cultivation for wages. The answer was a resounding no. One of Joseph's many blind spots was his inability to acknowledge the brutally hard work the cultivation of rice and cotton was. In his childhood idyll of plantation life, he interpreted the singing of workers in the fields as a sign of their contentment, not as a means of lightening unmitigated drudgery. Joseph commented that he never made another penny from the plantation. Columbia was an occupied city after the war. Some of the emancipated Woodmanston workers continued to live with the Lecontes, growing food for them all and helping Joseph ferry corn for Columbia from a plantation. The university finally reopened, and Joseph describes the effort to restore some semblance of social life. However, a Reconstruction threat caused the brothers to bolt. Joseph's daughter, Carrie, that's Joseph's son, Joseph, that's Joseph's daughter's Carrie, described what happened in this way. The South Carolina legislature, through its Negro Board of Trustees, was taking the first steps to declare the departmental chairs vacant and to convert the university into a school for illiterate Negroes. The Lecontes briefly considered flight to Mexico. The academic institutions of the North were closed to anyone who had been active supporting the Confederacy. The National Academy of Sciences, founded during the Civil War, specifically excluded anti-Union sympathizers, barring membership to the Lecontes until the 1870s, and in spite of their strong reputations in the sciences. And I should mention, actually, another famous scientist, Leconte, an entomologist who was their cousin, was actually a founding member of the National Academy, but he was also a Northerner. Though the brothers had many supportive friends among America's scientific elite, no Northern university would hire them. Louis Agassiz informed them that a new university was to be opened near San Francisco and urged the brothers to apply, where he believed they would find less prejudice. He assured them that we will back you with strong letters of support, and indeed, a number of eminent scientists wrote letters on their behalf. John wrote to California Assembly's champion for the university, John W. Dwinell, who responded, "I want professors from all parts of the country. I purposely excluded both religion and politics from the university in the bill under which we are acting." He added that if he had had John's experiences, he too might have acted as the brothers had. On November 17, 1868, John Le Conte was offered the professorship of physics by the University of California Regents, first professor to be hired. The following year, the Regents would ask him to come early and serve as acting president to organize instruction. John Le Conte was offered the professorship of geology, botany, and natural history on December 4, 1868, third professor to be hired. Eugene Hilgard, who was Joseph's friend and colleague and another faculty member from the South, reported that if anyone heard of the University of California during its first 30 years, it was owing to the fame of the brothers. Joseph Le Conte's biographer has commented that it was a serious blow to the University of South Carolina to lose its two eminent scientists. In 1869, Joseph Le Conte left two married daughters in the South when he boarded one of the first transcontinental trains from Omaha to Sacramento with his pregnant wife and youngest daughter, Carrie. Carrie describes him lecturing fellow passengers on geological formations as they crossed the country, emulating Louis Agassiz, who gave outdoor natural history lectures on the fly to all who would listen. Joseph's only son, Joseph Nisbet Le Conte, was born in Oakland in February 1870. The University of California opened in 1869. This actually was the campus occupied in Berkeley in 1873 with the first two buildings, South Hall and North Hall, and not a whole lot else. There were 38 students and 10 faculty the first year. After enrollment ups and downs, enrollment would not surpass 1,000 students until the 1890s. During those first years, the curriculum was limited and highly regimented. Any student who graduated before 1891 would certainly have had classes with both Joseph Le Conte and John Le Conte. They became beloved of their students, known as Professor John and Professor Joe. John Le Conte followed Agassiz's lead in organizing the university's first natural history museum, using specimens, fossils, and samples collected by the State Geological Survey. These he used as a basis for his pedagogy. Le Conte emphasized throughout his life, and this is a quote, that investigation ought not be separated from teaching, as many suppose. Not only is one the better teacher for being an investigator, but one is a better investigator for being a teacher. We never know any subject perfectly until we teach it. This value would continue to be embraced by the University of California. Harvard's philosopher Josiah Royce, arguably the first academic superstar with the University of California Baccalaureate, went so far as to characterize Leconte, the lecturer, as an artist. In his 1902 memorial to Joseph Le Conte, he described sitting with other students outside Joseph Le Conte's crowded lecture hall, even before taking his first official course with him, just to hear his lectures. Royce said, "The union of empirical data with speculative ingenuity appealed to my deepest instincts, as music, when first heard, awakens a sensitive young appreciation." Royce went on to say that Leconte desired to give our minds true freedom. Leconte's good friend, John Muir, whose geological findings in Yosemite Leconte had endorsed, said this: "As a teacher, he stood alone on this side of the continent, and his influence no man can measure. He carried his students in his heart and was the idol of the university." During his last years at the university, before his death in 1901, his students would honor him. This is an illustration of what I'm about to say here. His students would honor him on his birthday with a special gift and decoration of his teaching desk. One year, it was a portrait of Louis Agassiz. This paragon was also a vigorous defender of the theory of evolution. An 1895 San Francisco paper dubbed him the gentle apostle of evolution. And here is where his record of achievement crosses paths with the reasons for today's outcry against continuing to honor his name. He mentions in passing that he had conversations about the race question while he was in residence at Harvard. Louis Agassiz was part of one of those conversations. Agassiz had acted on his visceral racist reaction to Black people in America. According to his most recent biographer, Agassiz was something of a publicity hound and decided to advance his view that Black people were created as a separate species from white people. This idea had come up from time to time in the United States, and like Agassiz's idea, never gained much traction. As Agassiz discovered and complained to Leconte and others, he experienced a strong blowback from religious leaders. Their simple reason: the Bible said that all human beings descended from Adam and Eve. End of discussion. Leconte confesses to about Agassiz's argument initially, but was talked out of it. What he did discover was the theory of evolution, and in particular, Herbert Spencer. In his advocacy, Leconte was joined by virtually all the scientists on the West Coast, in contradiction to Agassiz, who spoke out against evolution to the end of his life. In Leconte's writing on the race problem starting in 1880, he applied what came to be labeled social Darwinism to a hierarchy among the races, leading to what he called white supremacy. He uses what is recognizable as the terminology of eugenics, a product of Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, who coined the term. Leconte overlaid this with a defense of the South. While he endorsed the Southern acts of segregation in progress, he actually began his argument with what sounds to me like a gritted teeth criticism of the pre-Civil War South. In particular, he argued that the South's aristocratic class, the plantation class in which he had grown up, had atrophied, and that the emancipation of enslaved Black people, whom he believed to be industrious and pliable, was necessary for them to take the next steps up the evolutionary ladder. Class was as much a feature of his arguments in evolution as it applied to race. Were all white people equal? He argued not, citing the South's white underclass, which he referred to as shiftless pine knockers and crackers. Yeah, I didn't even know the term was that old until I read his autobiography. People that even enslaved Black folks could feel superior to. Leconte's advocacy of white social leadership arose unquestionably from a fear for the parts of the South where African Americans outnumbered Caucasians. He favored keeping the vote in the hands of people of property and education. This, he said, would open the door to some African American voters and close the door to some other white voters. But it would maintain the elite white power, which was the bottom line of his arguments. In a sort of never land ending, he imagined an evolutionary future in which all the races had blended and there would no longer be race. Was there anything in Leconte's life that suggested he could have escaped the blindness evidenced in these ideas? With experience, he did have the capability to reform stereotypical ideas. When the University of California Regents, following the lead of the University of Michigan, began admitting women in the second year of instruction, Leconte was opposed. It took him only a year to change his mind and say, surely before long, female talent will be so far recognized that the professors' chairs may be occupied by them. Yet lacking a parallel California experience with African Americans, he remained imprisoned in the attitudes of his upbringing. Was there anyone to debate him at the time? He was attacked by religious leaders on his advocacy of the theory of evolution, though it isn't clear to me that any at all singled out his writing on race. A line of publications that he was very proud of, citing its positive reception, in particular among his students, was his effort to reconcile the belief of evolution with religious belief. To judge from Eugene Hilgard's National Academy of Sciences in memoriam, Leconte also received high praise from many scientists for this line of philosophical writing. One vastly admired scientist whose life and career overlapped with Leconte's put forth a view of racial difference that was the opposite of Leconte's. Alexander von Humboldt, whose writings on his Latin American explorations and discoveries made him, in Josiah Whitney's words, the doyen of sciences, wrote that race was determined by geography and diet, and that, in fact, no race was above another. However, as influential as he was, scientists of Leconte's era did not seem to be famously advocating this position. My newspaper recently reported on the Sierra Club's current consideration of John Muir's expressions of racism and included in their charge that he was a friend of known white supremacists. That would include not only Joseph Le Conte, but one of the Sierra Club founders and early board member, Stanford's David Starr Jordan. As I argued 5 years ago with the Sierra Club leadership, the people who contributed to the Leconte Memorial Lodge were not honoring a white supremacist. They were honoring a beloved UC teacher and Sierra Club officer. But we also know, as he couldn't, the social devastation that would flow from his ideas. The physics faculty's request to remove the name is simple and I think unarguable. His views, that is, Leconte's views on race, are antithetical to our University of California values. So the question is, how do we honor the good he did and the warm memories of those who knew him? Do we agree with the French proverb, to understand all is to forgive all, or are some things simply unforgivable? Is Mark Anthony's formulation the right one? The evil men do live after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. And a final different issue that I'll leave this presentation with. John Le Conte, the physicist and UC president, didn't publish on race. He was a slave owner. He did support the Confederacy's war effort. We might very well conclude that he wouldn't have disagreed with Joseph on the race problem, but it wasn't a part of his writing. But are the sins of that sort forgivable, and the Leconte name still can stay on the building that honors him? Or is his pre-California life too damning? And I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you, Karen, very much. That's a really excellent presentation. Now, I didn't know that much about Leconte's before your presentation, and I must say it's rather damning. However, let me not preempt a discussion here. Thoughts many of you have?
I've got a lot of interesting thoughts. I appreciated the presentation. So I wanted to start off with one obvious devil's advocate item, which is that the current generation of students likes to say they want to make a distinction between intent and impact, where when you make the point that naming the lodge after Leconte or naming the building after Leconte wasn't an effort, the intent was not to honor his pre-California history, but to honor his accomplishments in California, they would say, well, yeah, but their intentions don't matter if the impact is someone who we now know to have been a white supremacist is got a building named after him, and people who had to live with the consequences, or whose ancestors had to live with the consequences of that position, have to use that building all the time, that the impact outweighs any of the weighing the good versus the bad of the person's career. How do we feel about those kinds of arguments?
Well, the name was removed. The Sierra Club was, this was part of their own sort of beginning of self-examination, and the club, like a lot of environmental organizations, had, and I think to some extent still has, a great difficulty attracting membership of color. And particularly they were focusing on African Americans. So in a sense, once they came to the discovery, which had been actually on their website for some time and they just hadn't noticed, of Leconte's views on race, they wanted the name taken off because they didn't want, once they found it, basically they couldn't unring the bell, and they couldn't have their education center, which is what the Leconte Lodge is, associated with such antithetical ideas. So so they removed the name, and it's now Yosemite Education Center, still in operation.
So I'm curious to hear from other people here on the Zoom call. I'm sure everyone has heard this intent versus impact argument. And do you find it persuasive, or do you find it partially persuasive, or do you find it not persuasive? I personally have mixed feelings about the about the intent versus impact reason for removing names or changing or removing statutes.
So I'm gonna, I think, I'm gonna follow up on this, I think, in a slightly different way, which is to tease out this idea, Karen, which I thought was really interesting, of forgiveness. And what does it mean to forgive? And if we take the notion of forgiveness seriously, right, there's several, both contemporary and historical figures who we want to sort of say, what does it mean to forgive and what does it mean to reconcile, right? And I'm thinking particularly, I think South Africa did not a terrible job of this with its reconciliation work post-apartheid, right? But I think there's a difference between forgiveness and adulation, and I think, you know, it's one thing to consign Leconte to the rubbish bin of history, and it's another thing to have his name on a prominent building, right? And there's a place in between here, I think, where the complexities and the nuances and such can be worked out, where forgiveness can be a space. But I'm just not sure the front of a building is that space. There's broader questions on why are buildings named after people in the first instance. You know, given that people are human and flawed, and you know, mores and values change, there's just a bigger, I think, very practical question of why name things after people in the first instance. But sorry, that's a long-winded way of, I think, making a few different points.
Yeah, I think the Sierra Club's final solution to this, and their very first thing, was to try to hide the fact that John Muir was a very good friend and admirer of LeConte. But what they have now, I think, is what feels to me like a kind of balanced site on their website. They recognize his connection to them, that is, the historical connection, and his contemporaries' admiration, but they also call out the white supremacist writing. And at least to me, it feels, at first, like I say, they're really trying to hide that he had anything to do with John Muir. But now I think they've got a balanced way of removing the adulation, as you say, or removing the sign of the contemporary honor, and still recognizing both the good and that which is not good. So, I mean, that's one solution. But, you know, I don't know. Like I say, that it seems to me it's at least worth discussing whether, since it's a physics building, it could be named after John Le Conte properly, or is his life history just too indicative that he would have shared, and you know, maybe there's a letter somewhere that he wrote that would demonstrate that he shared Joseph's ideas. And that, just to me, that's an open question. It seems to me it's a more difficult case than naming something for Joseph Le Conte.
If I could make an observation here, though, the question is, who forgives, and what is the impact on African American students or any oppressed, underrepresented group in this country walking into a building which they now know is named after someone from the Confederacy and who served in that war. And one of the things I think which is part of the volatility of the moment is that I think the sort of cultural, what would we call them, almost gatekeepers of culture have never until recently given too much thought about the real impact of having students of color occupy this white world that we present. Of course, that's changed. We are no longer teaching only dead white men. But the penetration of other literatures and cultures in the general curriculum might still be an open question. And I must say, despite my own work, I never really had given too much thought until fairly recently, when there was this upwelling of fury against all these racist symbols. I mean, it's pretty obvious if it's a Confederate soldier or Lee. And it's fairly astounding that in New Orleans, all the streets are named after people who fought and lost a civil war. I mean, this is extraordinary. But again, I saw it as a historian and not as a, what does this mean for a Black person who has had their family endure all of this colossal exactitude from, that's not the word I'm looking for, help me out. It's exploitation is the word I'm looking for, of their people, and then have these symbols around which constantly remind them of that.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's
well, and I draw a distinction between the removal of the Confederate general monuments, which actually many of them were placed relatively recently,
right.
and to honor the traitors to the country, versus what we're wrestling with here is a person's intellectual beliefs of the time of which he was, which I think it's a very complicated issue.
I'm not saying Leconte and Confederate statues are the same thing. I'm just saying that's what's awoken my awareness.
Oh, I see. I get it. Yes, yes. It's very much part of our current discussion.
Yes.
Leconte's post-Civil War advocacy for what he advocated was very strong. I mean, he advocated violence against freed Black people because it was needed to keep them in their place. I mean, it's pretty strong. If you read through his writings, he doesn't mince words. I mean, he's very strong advocate for very strong social oppression. So we have to wrestle with that, I think.
Yes.
I would add to that it's not as if Leconte, as a professor, as part of the intellectual life of the university, was not exposed to racial ideas that were different from his own. I mean, we could say that somebody who lived, well, Sir Francis Drake, for example, there's a big fuss about changing the name of Sir Francis Drake Boulevard.
Right.
Okay, Drake lived long enough ago that he couldn't really help being what he was. But it seems to me that Leconte had an opportunity to reflect upon his views and to change them. And if he did not, then although I hate the idea of forgiving him, because I don't think that is in my power, but I could see that as an argument for changing the name of the building.
An interesting kind of sidelight to Woodmanston as it is today is he does, he says terrible things. He says, Joseph says a lot of really terrible things on the subject of what the South should be allowed to do in a segregated world. He did, it seems to me, recognize that the labor of the people at Woodmanston was not in and of itself tainted. And the descendants of a lot of the emancipated workers at Woodmanston stayed there, and he would see them when he'd go back and visit. And in fact, some grew cotton for their own use. Their descendants have built a replica of a slave cabin at Woodmanston, one of the two efforts to sort of recall what it was when it was a plantation. And it seems to me that, and they apparently, descendants have had some reunions there, that there's a way in which this doesn't really, I don't think this is on the, has anything to do with the naming issue at the University of California, but it's interesting to me that I see this as at least an act of reconciliation on their part, and honoring their own past, honoring what was admirable in their own past. And I think, I found it extremely moving.
Karen, an informational point. Did you recover anything about, did either of the Lecontes take positions on immigration issues in San Francisco in the 1870s and 1880s?
Not well. I mean, he wrote a lot, and I haven't come anywhere near reading everything. I certainly haven't run into any of that. He comments on other racial groups in sort of equally distressing ways. But I mean, he had actually Chinese cooks, as a lot of university faculty who could afford them did back then. But I haven't run into anything that was specific to immigration as a subject.
And then we said some things about race and class. Was there anything about religion? Did he ever say anything about Catholic residents of the Bay Area or the Catholic origins of Bay Area cities?
He was a basically kind of generic Protestant himself. He doesn't take that up. Now, I've never really read his. He wrote a lot on the how evolution and religion could be reconciled with each other. But what I have read of his, he wasn't tied to a specific sectarian point of view. So I certainly have never read anything.
Do we know if he was attending church while he was on faculty?
He went to several different churches, actually. Like I say, he's kind of a generic Protestant.
And of course, he did, as you mentioned, try to reconcile his racial beliefs with religion. And he sort of famously said that, well, we might have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, those laws, but so be it. They're wrong because they're in contradiction to the laws of God in terms of Black inferiority. So.
And he knows that because?
I have no idea.
He wrote a lot. Oh, you're wondering how, yeah.
Yeah.
He treated evolution basically as God's plan. And the wonderful thing about knowing the theory of evolution is you saw the clockworks in action. I mean, that was sort of the gist of it. That, again, wasn't a particularly unique idea among believing scientists in the late 19th century. But he wrote a lot on it.
Many Protestant denominations at the time supported the Confederacy.
Yeah.
Mm.
and quite a racist
Mhm.
perspective.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to bring in another kind of international aspect to this, which is I'm thinking of revolutionary France and then post-Republic France also, that it was normal to change all the names of the major streets in towns
Mm.
under
Right.
Napoleon, and then again in the Third French Republic, that same thing in post-colonial Latin America, that when you're wandering around in Tijuana and you're on Avenida de la Revolucion, that used to be named after the cathedral, or it used to be named after a landowner, and now it's called Revolution. And the same thing in any little town you've ever been to in France, all the streets coming off the main square, the main place, have been renamed at least once and probably several times. So, so if that's kind of normal in Western European and European descended history, why should we resist that trend today with anything other than, when I first moved to Berkeley, all of the Martin Luther King Jr. streets had been renamed and the schools had been renamed, but the grocery store on it was still called the Grove Street Grocery. So even though the street had been renamed, the markets along the street had not been renamed.
At least one of the questions is kind of the balance question. Is there a balance point? Is it okay to leave Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, even though we know he did things we don't approve of now? Or, how do you weigh that? That seems, it's two different questions. One, how do you weigh the good versus the bad in people who are being honored with these names, named streets, named schools, and the rest of it? How do we then also remember what's the right way to go about making a record? Because these are histories that shouldn't be forgotten, for better and for worse.
So if
There
I
was the
can,
question. Oh, sorry. The
Sorry.
question of impact is something that
I apologize.
Oh, okay. I thought it was ours.
in terms of, for example, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, the issue has been raised by the contemporary Coast Miwok people, and I would be all in favor of changing the name of the road to Miwok Road, because they are consciously giving that address, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, to someone, or saying, I live here, or I live near Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, and it brings up historical issues of the treatment of their ancestors. So I think impact is very important. I wonder about the impact of, although I think that Kant should be changed, but I wonder how many people who pass it by have any idea of who Leconte, have that much of an idea, perhaps until now, but how many of them over the years knew that about him. I didn't, and I was both an undergraduate and a graduate student at Berkeley. I had no idea about Leconte's racism.
It's the unringing the bell problem. Once you've rung the bell, as Anne says, a Black physics student going into Leconte Hall now might be reminded by that name of something that was oppressive to his past. So I think the unringing the bell side of it is a difficult and a thorny one, and needs to be addressed.
So sorry to jump in if I'm interrupting. Just two distinct things. One on renaming, I think, and I'll just make the point that we don't bat an eyelid when buildings and stadiums and the such are renamed for seven-figure sums of money. There just is no discussion, right? Who did what, whose name's on it, whose name will be on it. It doesn't. The University of Phoenix Stadium is now the State Farm Stadium, is now the, you know, Donald Brent School of Law, is now the call it what you will. And I wonder, you know, capitalism is a value. And at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is what are the value, right? So academic instruction's a value, and sort of you know, Leconte as a professor and as sort of a pioneer in his field as a value, and how do we reconcile those values with some of the more, let's say, abhorrent values that he also held on to. My sort of argument to this is, we changed, I mean, this would be a moot point if I paid the Sierra Club, you know, $40 million to take off Leconte's name and put my name on it, right? and we wouldn't question. So I think there's just something to think about there. The second question here is, you know, you said Leconte wrote a lot. To whom, and who was pushing back, and with what purpose, and what sort of the milieu of the conversations that he's having as he's writing, in what context?
He wrote to popular outlets. So the Berkeleyan is the first one that that is listed, in fact, in his bibliography. Overland Magazine was a widely read magazine, and some of it was reprints of, at least one was a reprint of a talk that he gave. And then
do you have a sense of like letters to the editor in response, or any personal correspondence with folks pushing back?
I doubt it. I haven't looked at the actual, you know, issues in which these appeared. But no, the pushback was, I think, the pushback to evolution as a theory is still going on in some quarters of the United States. So I think from the get-go, there were always people of religious backgrounds, or you know, ministers and whatnot, who objected to it. Josiah Whitney was trying to educate, when he was heading the Geological Survey in California. He was trying to educate the legislature on the theory of evolution. And he thinks one reason he couldn't get funding for the survey was because religious leaders were outraged that he was doing this. And it's all over the place in the 19th century. But that didn't, I mean, like I say, there were other scientists. In fact, that's Eugene Hilgard's In Memoriam points to one of the scientists who was very grateful that Leconte was trying to reconcile religion with evolution. It was a very 19th century kind of thing to do, I think.
Sure. But if I could also come in on the point of whose forgiveness. I mean, Sir Francis Drake was a brigand, a pirate, and he was honored because he was a very successful pirate.
Right.
And so the Queen bestowed a knighthood on him. However, there's a big difference from the era of the Tudors to today. I mean, Leconte's opinions and his arguments still are with us in a way, whereas the Tudor era is rather over. So maybe Sir Francis Drake might be fairly neutral to Americans simply because he may or may not have sailed off the coast of California and landed at Drake's Bay. But his actual impact on the history of California is somewhat minimal. but he's still a brigand. And we have a tendency to honor people in the distant past in ways which may not be commensurate with their actual, in this case, very bloody activities. So I think the argument for LeConte and the removal of the name is a historiography that deals with him simply has to present the many sides of his points of view. But it would seem to me fairly convincing that no building should be named after him, nor even after his brother, because it's still, the name is a monument to the South, in a sense.
Agreed.
Well, the thing that strikes me in wrestling with this, and we've talked about it at least tangentially, is how much LeConte's thinking was so mainstream. I mean, he would not be seen in any way, shape, or form, as an outlier. He was the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in 1892, when he gave his public lecture on the race problem in the South, he had actually been elected the president of the American Academy of Science. So, so I think in evaluating this, what's that?
It's a AAAS. He's president of AAAS.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, so that's just one context or perspective. I'm trying to wrestle with this.
I wanted to bring up to say that that's true with two cases that I'm still scratching my head over are Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
Oh,
That it's like in terms of my learning about American history, I was, when I was first learning about Woodrow Wilson, and I was thinking about, again, with the San Francisco connection with the establishment of the League of Nations, right, and all of his internationalism and his diplomacy and sort of the other that I would always at first hold up Wilson as, well, here's an example of the rare evangelical Protestant that we should admire. But then by the time I had just gotten around to saying, oh, okay, here's a WASP I can get behind, all of a sudden I started to find out all these other things about Wilson, and I realized, oh, well, maybe he was not someone that we should keep admiring. And then the same thing with Teddy Roosevelt as a manly progressive. And to say that, oh, there's Teddy Roosevelt is someone that we can sort of like look back admirably and be glad that there are things named after him. But then once you look and find out a little more about his interests in colonialism and his attitudes towards various ethnicities and things, that you realize, well, maybe he was not someone that we'd want to laud.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a discussion that's going on right now. Exactly. I mean, that at least one way I like to think about Jefferson, who I would prefer to see his name preserved where it's preserved, and the Jefferson Memorial to be preserved, is did people who did things not acceptable to us now have ideas that liberated future generations? And the interesting thing to me is I read a very interesting book called Bind Us Apart about segregation in the North, the creation of segregation in the North among abolitionists, that the idea of it and the actual practice of it. And it seems to me, if of course, what they were always seizing on was the language of equality that was the founding principle of America. And it seems to me that maybe part of the balances that you're trying to create also ask the question, was the long-term effect actually to liberate people, as opposed to continuing the detestable practices? And unfortunately, I have to say, when I read Leconte on the subject of voting rights in the South, I'm sort of hearing the governor of Georgia It's it's unfortunately the truth on us is his very blatant ideas are being expressed as blatantly now as ever they were. And so you don't feel the progress that maybe all men are created equal has gotten us to a good place, that at least his writing on race has not gotten us to a good place now.
Well, Mel?
On that, I think there's a difference between a Leconte theorem that is used in physics, right? And then a Leconte building that is seen by and used by and has context beyond physics. And so I think the ideas are I think this idea of the idea is important and useful, and actually and very productive. But that has to be, again, then domain specific, right? So we say Leconte was a physicist, and the same with Roosevelt and maybe Jefferson, right? Leconte was a physicist. So if we cabin our admiration of him to the realm of physics, then we can sort of talk about something. I'm not sure why, in a sense, we would want to admire him for anything else, given what we know about the way that he conducted himself outside, right? And so maybe we can find a way to cabin some of these things and hold what needs to be held and reject what needs to be rejected, in that sense.
Well, that seems very reasonable to me.
Yeah. Just to be a little facetious, it seems like, we have the triumvirate of research, teaching, and public service. Seems like Leconte was great in teaching and research, but he dedicated his public service to publicizing very broadly and consistently and continuously his absolute racist views.
Yeah, don't mix John and Joseph up. I mean, your case,
Yeah.
Could John be admired and celebrated with a name on a building? And I think Anne brought up some problems with doing that too. But I think Joseph, it's more difficult to make the case for Joseph, I think.
Well, I think there's another issue about how science is perceived and the very low participation of African Americans or other underrepresented groups in STEM majors. And part of it has to do with not racism particularly, but with the sort of Mertonian idea that science is neutral and who does science doesn't make any difference. This is a problem. And I think if the association is a public one with eminent scientists who are critical, though, in the development of the profession and discipline, with this more public notion. I mean, it really comes back to what you're suggesting, Amal. You can celebrate Leconte for his theorems within the confined context, but perhaps, of course, this would argue for a slightly different way of teaching also science, that there be a distance established between the scientist as a scientist and his social theories.
Yeah, I mean, expertise is a real thing, right? And there's the person, and frankly, as we're talking about that time, for the most part, the man as scientist, right? And then the man as a man who knows about things, which I think is not a notion that we particularly want to or even can hold on to. but your point about teaching science in a wider context is, I think, you know, well taken here, right? This person, you know, and I'm sure for folks as we go, as we dig deeper into the histories and historiographies of individuals, we'll find, as we are finding, great achievements coupled with horrific, both ideas and in some cases actions,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to, at the risk of, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we also can't sort of keep bathing in the same bathwater, right?
Right.
And we have to sort of figure out how to take the baby out and towel it off, at the risk of stretching the metaphor.
Right.
We talked about this when the nation talked about this when the Martin Luther King statue went up in Washington, D.C., and the issues around whitewashing Martin Luther King and turning him into a figure that sort of like fits into the arc of American history rather than someone who resisted the arc of American history and was interested in a lot more than just race. He also was interested in economic justice and other issues. And to bring it back to campus, I think about the number of times I've been at events with our Nobel laureates where the Nobel laureates were somehow called upon to make comments or express their views on things other than the field that they won their prize for.
Mhm.
And my personal experience with it is that some of them are a little on the kooky side. That
Right.
because our winners are in physics and economics, and maybe we've got a medicine or bio winner here on campus, and I've run into them at religious services, I've run into them at sports games, I've run into them at just social events, and when you hear their opinions on something other than what they are experts in, you say, well, yeah, you might know an awful lot about physics or about lasers or something, but when it comes to Bay Area politics, I'm not so convinced. That the issue of veneration, taking out all of the detail from someone's life story is something that we have to keep in mind on, but that's the fact of putting a name on a building or a statue or a street that has a venerative quality to it. You're ignoring certain bits of that person's output.
Mhm.
Well, that's again the balance. Where how does one side weigh the other? When perfection's really hard to find. So probably going to come up with something to criticize with a lot of different people. So the Sierra Club's kind of going through that now with John Muir.
Yeah.
Does his I'm pleased to say I warned them they might run into this, that they imagined that John Muir was free of these destructive thoughts about race, and indeed they've discovered he isn't. But if they examine, I think, their leadership for the first decades of the Sierra Club, they may be hard pressed to find someone who embraces the social justice ethos that we all hope we're embracing now.
Right. Well, that seems the perfect note to end on. As our time has
Thank you, Anne.
Well, what a lovely presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And
Learned
I
a
hope
lot.
it will be a paper.
Yeah, I'll have to make it a paper. It's a hard one to write. I mean, as you can tell, I really like the Leconte family a lot. I've read a lot of really wonderful things that they wrote. And so it's hard. It's very hard.
I agree. Well, thank you all for your participation and engagement.
Thanks to everybody who came.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Cheers.
Yes.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Anne.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
sir.
Thank you so much. Thank
Nice
you.
to see you, as ever.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Here we go.